All right, all right. Well, listen, it is another opportunity for relationship empowerment. That's right. Listen, this is your host, pastor and therapist, Marcus Ruffin. And listen, I am glad to be here with you today. I'm glad that we are here in the house. We're here in your house. We're here in my house. Well, listen, we are ready to get started and to understand how might we grow today in our relationships. How might we become the kind of person that is substantive in our relationships? We are not just looking to be better. Listen, we're looking to also have something better. Listen, we are called to have relationships that are fulfilling, relationships that are sustaining, relationships that are empowering. And so, listen, I am glad to be here with you. Now, listen, as you all know, it's our way of doing things here at Ruffin. And here's what we always ask you to do: share. Listen, we ask you to share so that we might be able to bring others. Listen, there's somebody else you know that needs relationship empowerment. And so, listen, I'm asked that if you're on Facebook, maybe you start a watch party. I'm asking that if you're on Facebook, maybe you put somebody's name in the comment section. But I'm saying that you have the opportunity to empower somebody else today for relationships. So listen, I am encouraging you to go ahead and do just that. Listen, if you're on our YouTube channel, I'm saying for you to go ahead and share the link. Go ahead and share that with somebody. Share it to them in a text. Share it to them in an email. Share it to them, because you know that, listen, here at Ruffin It, listen, by the time we are finished, you know that you are empowered. You know that you have been given substance. You know that you've been given some insight. You've been given some knowledge, some information. It's our goal that you would be wiser at the end of this time. And so, listen, I am encouraging you to go ahead and make that happen now, because, listen, this is going to be a great time today. And so, listen, I am looking forward to all those that are joining me here at LifeEmpowermentCh on our page. Now, listen, you remember the instructions. If this is your first time, let me give them to you. We believe in giving feedback. We believe in asking questions right in the moment. This is a live broadcast. And so we give you the opportunity to be able to ask us about what it is that we're teaching, to ask us any kind of questions concerning this topic that we're covering today. But the only way I'm going to see those questions is for you to come to our Life Empowerment Church page, or for you to come to our YouTube page, YouTube channel. That's the only way I will be able to see your comments, be able to see your questions, and I want to see them. I want to be able to talk back with you. I want this to be a time in which we are engaging with one another. I'm not looking for this just to be a monologue. Although I know that I'm the one talking, I'm looking for us to have a dialogue as you engage in this particular time. And so, listen, we thank you so much for being here today. We thank you for taking time out of your schedule, whether you're watching this on the live broadcast or you're watching this on a replay. We thank you so much for you being here. And so, listen, there's just one other thing I want to make sure that I bring to your attention. Something else I want to make sure that you are fully aware of. Hold up, let me make sure that my PowerPoint is ready to go. All right, I was having just a little technical difficulties there. But listen, we are ready to go. Let me go ahead and bring down the music as we are going forward here right now. Listen, we're ready to go ahead and get started. Yeah, this is the moment. This is the time. And so, listen, we want to let you know, listen, we're talking from our book here, Boundaries. And so it's the book by Dr. Henry Cloud, Dr. John Townsend. And so they have two different versions. I'm using this version. They also have a newer, updated version. It's called Boundaries both versions. It's just a different time in which they were actually written. But listen, we're covering not page to page. We're just talking about information chapter to chapter. And so today, listen, I want to also remind you that if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, please make sure that you subscribe to our channel. Make sure that you hit that bell icon so that you can get the notifications when we go live. And listen, if you are watching on Facebook, listen, we want you to like our Life Empowerment Church page. We want you to follow us because we believe that, listen, we're living out exactly our mandate to empower, to maximize people for life and eternity. And so, listen, so we just thank you so much for being here today. And listen, I always ask you to do this last thing: like, share, follow, comment. Those 4 things: like, share, follow, comment. Listen, we want this to be an engage in a time in which we are engaging with one another. And so I thank you so much for being here. Listen, as we are going right into Ruffin It. So listen, this particular segment, listen, we want to talk about parental boundaries. We're talking about parenting boundaries. Now listen, we're talking about it whether you have young children, whether you have older children, or whether you have adult children. Yeah, that's right. We're going to talk about some principles today that will cover the gamut on all different stages of parenting, because as much as the children may have left your home, the reality is that you are still parenting from afar. There is still a level of guidance. There's still a level of instruction that you're giving your children. And so we want to talk about what does that look like when we're looking at parenting boundaries. All right, so listen, we always like to start off with a particular passage. Now, I know that there are people who are watching that may not subscribe to the Christian faith, but listen, I believe that the Bible speaks to all humanity, and there are principles that I believe that we can look at that apply to all persons. So here out of Proverbs 22, verse 6, it says, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. It says, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, there's an old adage. You may have heard of it. I know I have heard of it. I've actually seen a book, and there may be several books that are written on it. But the adage goes, everything you needed to learn in life, you learned in kindergarten. And the premise is that a lot of the principles that you and I need to thrive in life, we understood the roots of them when we were children, when we were in kindergarten. Well, I would say to you that a lot of who we are today is rooted in what we have learned in our earlier years of life. Good, bad, ugly, somewhere in between. A lot of who we are, good and bad, can be traced back to a lot of what we were trained, a lot of what was cultivated, a lot of what was deposited in us. And therefore, when we understand this passage, when it says train a child, listen, whether your parents, your guardians, whoever raised you were intentional about what they were training, or whether they were intentional, the reality is they were still training. They were still imparting. They were still cultivating. And sometimes the things that we're wrestling with in our adult life is the root of it comes from when we were in our earlier years. Listen, the values that you have, the preferences for food that you enjoy. Listen, your friendships, even the spouse that you choose often has something to do with your earlier stages of life. You know, it's funny. Now, my wife, Coach LaTerra, is not here today. Today is her birthday, and so she's doing all sorts of things, enjoying herself. But one of the things I would say that when it came to choosing her, it was funny that I found out along the way, because we met in graduate school, I learned that she had a nursing background. Now, what was so funny about that is that I come from a lineage of nurses. My grandmother was a nurse. My mother is a nurse. My sister is a nurse. My great aunt is a nurse. I have a cousin that is a nurse. I have a lot of nurses in my family. And so as much as I was not necessarily aware of how much that cultivated a certain liking and taste, when I chose my spouse, the reality is I'm sure that that had something to do with it. Although it was not, quote, known, it was still a true variable. And so when you think about training, it is recognizing that a lot of what we have learned goes back to what was imparted, what was instilled, what we came to believe to be true about life. And so when we begin to now understand this whole idea of parental boundaries, it is understanding that I learned, or I should have learned, or I did learn, good or bad, remember, I learned about bonding or relationships in my family. I learned about attachment, heart connections in my family. I learned about responsibilities and boundaries in my family, learning how to say yes, learning how to accept no's. All of those things came about in my family, my childhood upbringing. And so therefore, this is why we all know adults who are adults in body, but they are children in development. And we can, if we spend a little time, if we took a little time out to really trace some of their underdevelopment, some of their insufficiencies, we could trace it back to the reality that there were certain things that were either left out, not acquired, not learned, and it went back to who they are or who they were as children. And so this is why when we're talking today about parental boundaries, doesn't matter whether your children are young, old, or they are adults, the reality is that we are still parenting in some degree. And so one of the things that this chapter in particular points out is the difference between instilling and repairing boundaries. That's right. Let me say that to you again. One of the things that it points out that is important in this particular book is the importance of understanding the difference between instilling boundaries and repairing boundaries. There's an old saying that says an ounce of prevention far exceeds a pound of treatment. Let me say that to you again. There's an old saying that goes, an ounce of prevention far exceeds a pound of treatment. And so when you and I begin to understand that there's either the instilling or the repairing of boundaries, no matter where our children may be on the continuum, the reality is even where you and I may be on the continuum, there is still instilling and there is still repairing that is at work. And so when you begin to understand that piece, you have to begin to ask yourself, how much were you taught concerning responsibility? How much were you and I taught when it comes to having limit setting? How much were you and I taught about delayed gratification? Did our parents just allow us to have anything and everything at the beck and call? And so therefore we really never learned how to have boundaries. We really never learned how to accept a no. We really never learned how to embrace no, not now. And so when you begin to understand, going back to our starting place of training a child, see, listen, I can only train where I have been trained. I can only instill what has been instilled in me. And so as much as we've had good parents, good guardians, people that had good intentions, sometimes the reason why we have reached where we have reached, sometimes underdeveloped, is simply because they gave us the best that they had, but the best that they had was not really good in all areas and all categories. And that's true for all of us, some more, some less than others. And so therefore, when you and I recognize that we may lack in some area when as it relates to responsibility, as it relates to limit setting, as it relates to delayed gratification. Sometimes we're having trouble telling our own selves no. And so how can we help anybody else learn how to accept a no when we ourselves are at the same childish place? And so listen, I just want you to know that if you have questions, please make sure that you put those on our YouTube page, or you put those on our Life Empowerment Church Facebook page, so that I can see the questions that you might have, because we're talking about parental boundaries, boundaries with children, young, old, or adult. All right. So notice now, we're talking about instilling or repairing boundaries. Here's the reality. The later we start, the harder we and they, the children, have to work, and it's often met with resistance. Let me say that again. Listen, the later we start, it doesn't matter, listen, doesn't matter if they're 24. Doesn't matter if they're 30. It doesn't matter, listen, if they're 12. The reality is sometimes we're behind the 8 ball. We're behind schedule. And this is why sometimes we're feeling and seeing the resistance that we are experiencing, because we've started so late trying to build something that should have been built or been in the process or in place way back when they were a lot younger. This is why an ounce of prevention far exceeds a pound of treatment. Why? Because it's going to require a lot more time, a lot more energy, a lot more patience when you're starting late instead of starting early. And so therefore, this is why you have to be able to assess, am I instilling this particular trait? Am I instilling this particular value? Am I just starting to set up this particular boundary now? And am I starting too late for what it is that they need to now embrace, impart, and own in their life? And so listen, as we are looking here at talking about boundaries with children, you've got to understand that there's boundary development with children. Listen, there's boundary development when they're young. There's boundary development when they're old. There's boundary development when they are adults. See, as much as they may have left the house, the reality is that there's still more for them to learn. There's still more for us to impart in them. There is still more that we need to be able to pass on to them. And so therefore, it's not parenting only when they're in the home. It's parenting when they're outside the home, but it's being able to understand, what does that boundary look like? And so when you talk about boundary development with children, this word discipline, for some people, it has different definitions. It has different meanings. But when you look at Old English, when you look at even some of the Old Hebrew and Greek, where some of our English words derive from in their origin, you find that that word discipline means teaching, not correction, not punishment, but that word means teaching. So when we're talking about having boundaries with children, and we're talking about developing these boundaries, remember, we're young, old, or adults, it is understanding that the first way that this boundary development happens is that there is teaching. See, when you look here at the screen behind me, boundary development, remember now, boundary development has to do with positive facets of discipline. See, there's the proactivity, there's the prevention, there's the instruction. When we're talking about boundary development, we're being able to assess the teaching that needs to happen. See, there are times in which we are in correction, we're in punishment, and there hasn't really been discipline. There really hasn't been teaching. And so therefore, we're often jumping the gun because we thought that there was discipline. We thought that there was teaching. But in all reality, there hasn't been teaching. I'm going to get into how do we know when discipline has really been effective. See, listen, full education. Remember this word here, discipline means to teach. And so therefore, we're talking about educating. So if we're going to look at a full educated child, whether we're talking young, old, or adult, if we're talking a full educated, we're talking about a child in which, here's the way that we can assess it. Can you tell me what I told you? See, if you can't even tell me what I told you, we can't get into behavior. We can't get into demonstration. We can't talk about execution. Can you tell me what I told you? Do you know how much is lost sometimes in just the whole communication process? And we're thinking that the person heard what we said. And the reality is that if they can't tell us what we said, then they haven't heard us. And so if we're going to look at development, boundary development, then we're going to have to be able to say, can the child tell me what I've said? Then after we look at, can they tell me what I said? Can you show me what I showed you? See, listen, if I'm going to develop, if I'm going to teach, if I'm going to fully educate, I need to make sure that you heard what I said. And I need for you to make sure that what I showed you, in terms of what I was trying to get you to execute, that you can show me that same thing again. See, if you can't tell me what I said and you can't show me what I said, there really hasn't been discipline. There really hasn't been any teaching. There really hasn't been full education. And so if we jump to correction, if we jump to punishment without having assured ourselves that there has been true education, then I'm telling you, we are setting ourselves up for failure. And so this is the reason why I need you to understand that when we're talking about boundary development with children, that it starts off with the positive of being able to say, I'm being proactive, I'm being preventive, and I'm being instructive, which means, in essence, I am educating. So we're saying, how can we assess whether or not there's been full discipline, there's been full education? It's one, remember, can you tell me what I told you? Can you show me what I showed you? And then can you consistently demonstrate it without me being around? Yeah, that's right. Listen, at some point, after you have shown me that you know what you're doing, I should be able to go away, do something else, come back and see that you've done exactly what needed to be done, because now I can say without a shadow of doubt, there has been full education, there has been full discipline, there has been full teaching, because you heard me, you have demonstrated that you saw me, and now you have demonstrated that you can do it when I'm not around. And so this is where we start when we talk about boundary development with children. See, listen, I can tell you a story as it related to teaching my children about chores. I had to first tell them what a clean room looked like. I had to tell them what that looked like. Then I had to show them what that looked like. And then I had to let them take it from there. But here's what I would tell you. That when I saw them do a top-notch, excellent job, I knew that education had been completed. And listen, now I could hold them to the standard in which I wouldn't let them do anything less. And the reality is that when you and I are talking about discipline, being proactive, looking at it from the positive facets first, it's when you and I are going to be proactive, we're going to be preventive, and we're going to be instructive. Now, with development of a boundary, you've got to be able to move from the positive to the negative. This is when we talk about correction. This is when we talk about chastisement. This is when we talk about consequences. See, listen, if you don't ensure that education and the positive facets have happened, you will prematurely correct, you will prematurely discipline, you will prematurely chastise. Why? Because you can't hold them accountable to something that they have not fully learned how to do. And so now that you can understand that they know what they're doing, now you can hold them accountable with correction, chastisement, and consequences. Sometimes this is when we have to let the child suffer the results of their actions to learn a lesson in responsibility. Now, I would tell you, I think sometimes this is harder with some parents. Sometimes this may be harder with the mother than the father. Sometimes this may be harder with the father than the mother. I think sometimes it depends upon the gender of the children. You know, sometimes the girls have that daddy's relationship, and sometimes boys have that mama's relationship. And so the reality is that sometimes in this next phase of them developing boundaries, it is being able to let them sometimes suffer the results of their consequences. Let me give you an example. Going back to chores, I can remember we've been educated. They know when this is supposed to be done, how this is supposed to be done, so they're not ignorant of the expectation and the standard. And I can remember that there would be times in which, you know, sometimes we, even as adults, will procrastinate, put things off to the last minute, and then we're in a bind. Well, remember, we're helping to develop boundaries with children, right? And so you've got to be able to help them learn lessons in safe environments. And so here, they knew their chores were supposed to be done before we go to any kind of leisure activities on the weekend. And just like you, just like myself, sometimes they had to learn the value of procrastination. And it would be time to go, and I would look around and I would say, well, hold up, our chores done. And, oh, man, you talking about getting upset, you talking about getting mad, you know, all the kind of negative feedback that, you know, we can receive as parents. But they had to understand that, listen, you know what's expected, you know what to do. But the reality is that if I don't hold you accountable, if I do not help you cultivate the positive, being proactive, being responsible, following the instructions, then the reality is then I have to let you learn on the backside. That's right, and sometimes it is just that, the backside. But I have to let you learn on the backside, and so sometimes it's the built-in consequence, it's the built-in discipline, it's the built-in correction, it's the built-in consequences. And therefore, when we were late for events or they missed out on going certain places, they really felt the value of being proactive and not procrastinating. And sometimes when we're talking about helping our children to grow and to develop, young, old, and adults, that concept does not change. Sometimes we have to let them feel that when they're adults and they have been irresponsible with money. And sometimes we got to let them feel the weight of what that looks like, what that entails. So yeah, they may have to go without their water. They may have to be late to work. They may even suffer some greater consequences. But if we're going to have parental boundaries, we're going to have to be able to allow the discipline process, the teaching process, that can be both positive and it can be both negative. Why? Because when we're talking about good rearing, it involves both prevention, it involves training, it involves practice, it involves correction, it involves consequences. And anytime we try to rob anyone of that process, we rob them of development, we rob them of maturity, we rob them of adulthood. And don't get me wrong, there are exceptions to the rules. Of course, there are sometimes things that are outside the norm. But when this becomes a way of life, when this becomes a way that we usually go about doing things, we set them up for failure. And the reality is sometimes we were set up for failure, and we are nothing more than duplicating the process because we failed to recognize, going back to where we started in the beginning, train a child in the way they're to go, that we did not get the training, we didn't get the teaching, we didn't get the discipline. And so now we're trying to raise and rear and develop in a blind spot. And I'm not saying you're blind in every area, but I'm saying in this area, you may be blind. In this area, you may be underdeveloped. In this area, you yourself may need some more discipline. You may need some more teaching. You may need some more help. And so if that's the case, not a problem, because remember, the second place of where we started is, are we instilling or are we repairing? And sometimes, like our children, we are instilling, and sometimes we are repairing. Now, remember, if you have questions, I don't mind answering your questions right here on the YouTube channel or on our Facebook page. And so remember now, we're talking about boundary development with children. And so therefore, listen to this, maturity is learned by getting information, applying it poorly. See, this is the reason why sometimes we don't attempt new things, because we're like, well, I don't want to fail. But the reality is, anytime I'm learning something new and I am wanting to become mature in it, I'm going to fail a few chances. I'm going to fail maybe a few times. And that's okay if you understand the maturity process. But when you have a perfection process, it does not allow maturity in the interim. And therefore, if it doesn't go right the first time, we back out, we quit, and we will abandon projects, we will abandon people, because we are looking for a perfected process. And God never called us to a perfected process. He called us to a mature process. And therefore, maturity is learned through getting information, applying it poorly, making mistakes, but then learning from those mistakes and doing it better every time we get an opportunity thereafter. And this is why I'm saying to you that if we're going to have boundaries with children, if we're going to, young, old, and adults, it is understanding this process of boundary development, because here's the ultimate goal of discipline. The ultimate goal of discipline is that I learn the external in order to develop the internal. Let me say that again. The ultimate goal of discipline, remember teaching, positive and negative, whether I'm being proactive or I'm being corrected, whether I am being preventive or I'm having to suffer consequences. The ultimate goal at the end of that process is that I would learn the external so I might develop the internal. Let me go back to my chore example that I've started using. After a while, my children should develop a disgust for uncleanliness. As much as I have taught them how to clean, I have shown them how to clean, I have demonstrated to them how to clean, and now they are able to demonstrate the same concept. After some point, they should now not just be going through the motions. They should now have developed within them a disgust for uncleanliness. So they're not waiting for me to tell them to clean it up. They're not waiting for me to be able to show them that something is dirty. After some point, they now have a grasp this same concept to where they are applying it in their own lives. This is how you and I are able to evaluate and assess where our children are in their development. Remember, young, old, or adults. And the reality is sometimes we have adults that are our children and they're immature in this area. And we sometimes don't want to acknowledge that. Sometimes it's our faults as parents. Sometimes we don't want to acknowledge it because we don't want to hurt their feelings. Sometimes we don't want to acknowledge that because we don't want to be the bearer of bad news. But the reality is, if you don't tell them, how will they know? If you don't bring it to their attention, how will they learn? Remember, discipline is teaching. It starts off by teaching. And so whether I'm on the positive or the negative, I'm still teaching so that you might ultimately take this from the external and now make it the internal so that you are able to walk out the principle because now you own it. And it is not just some ethereal concept, but it is now a life principle that you live by. Remember, we're talking about boundaries with children. And so therefore, boundaries with children go from the positive to the negative. And then there are times in which it moves to the punishment. See, if we don't understand this whole boundary development, we'll jump from teaching straight to punishment because we feel like, I told you once, you should have gotten it. I told you twice, you should have gotten it. When the whole education process entails me telling you, me showing you, you showing me, you telling me, and then you're being able to demonstrate it when I am not present, and I can come back and see that you're able to do the very thing that you showed me and told me that you were able to accomplish. Sometimes after we have moved from the positive to the negative, sometimes we have to move to the punishment. And this is the payment for wrongdoing. This is like the penalty for breaking the law. See, the reason why sometimes we have unruly adult children in the world is simply because we didn't give them the kind of infrastructure in the home so that when they went outside the home, the law wasn't anything different than the law inside of our home. But when we have not held them to any kind of limits, when we have not delayed any kind of gratification, when we have not put in the infrastructure by which they understand how to submit to authority, we release them in life, and they're nothing more than a child in an adult body. And it is up to us to be able to give them the kind of teaching, the kind of discipline, positive and negative, and sometimes we have to even move to the punishment stage. See, this is when you have done wrong over a period of time. See, I'm not jumping to punishment simply because I don't like what happened, simply because I'm upset by what happened, simply because I'm enraged by what happened. Now, granted, I know children can sometimes do some things that will literally is the last straw on the camel's back. I get that. I listen, they can sometimes do some things that will literally make you feel like you have blown a gasket. I get all that. But who's the parent? Who's the adult here? Who's the responsible one? And sometimes we have to grow up at the same time we're trying to grow our children. And sometimes that's just a reality because of where we are in our own development. But sometimes being a grown adult that is parenting children that are young, old, and adults is recognizing that sometimes I've got to use punishment in order to help them to learn the lesson that is at hand. And therefore, because I'm helping them to learn this lesson that is at hand, punishment is the last result that I go to in order to get them to have correction, in order to get them to the straight and narrow, to get them on the right path. And this is why I'm saying to you, for you to be able to recognize this so that you can grow healthy children, you can grow strong children. Because remember, going back to where we started in the beginning, and maybe you weren't here when we started in the beginning, but a lot of what we see in adulthood can be traced back to our early stages in life. And so listen, if you have come maybe somewhere partially halfway through this, no problem, because this will be uploaded to our Facebook page and to our YouTube channel, and you can watch this definitely on the rebroadcast. So listen now. Here is something that this chapter pointed out that I thought was very, very significant. Some of this we may have mentally understood, but I don't know that we always practice this. And here's what I'm sharing with you. it talks about these adulthood convictions. Adulthood convictions. And they're saying that, listen, by the time children have left the home, now, and I would say leaving the home can mean even after they've gone to college and they return home, and they're now going to leave and kind of experience independent adulthood, not necessarily dependent adulthood. They're still living in your home. There's still a level of dependency that they have. And so when I'm talking about them leaving your house, I'm talking about them being able to be full-fledged independent adults. Now, granted, once again, sometimes there are things happen in which they need help, but I'm saying that those are exceptions. Those are not the norm. And so when we talk about these adult convictions, they list them this way. Number one, and not that these are in order, but I'm just saying number one. My success or failure, it largely depends upon me. My success or failure in life largely depends on me. Is that a conviction that we have developed? Is that a conviction that we've cultivated? See, if we haven't been cultivating this independence over time, if I go back to just my chore example, if they are still teenagers and I'm still cleaning up behind them, they're still not owning this, it says something about where they are with this conviction. Now, I know all of us have teens that grow at different spaces and places, and I get all that, but I'm just saying, we're talking about once they are now leaving, they're ready to leave the house. They return from college. Are they still dealing with some of these same variables that apply to whether or not they recognize that their success is largely dependent upon them? Number two, notice now it says, though I look to God and others for comfort and instruction, I alone am responsible for my choices. This is, they're saying, listen, when you talk about having a child that has developed over time, they're ready to face full adulthood, this should be a conviction that they have. That though I look to God and others for comfort and instruction, I alone am responsible for my choices. How many adults do we know that still have a problem with this? How many, once again, we may all kind of find ourselves in a place where we kind of have some kind of fallback. You know, it's like, oh man, you know, I start playing the blame game. I start looking at everybody else because I don't want to take responsibility. But once again, that should be more the exception than the norm. Look at this next one that is here when we're talking about adulthood. Now, see, here's the reality. Adulthood, we have often ascribed it to an age. And what the book is really talking about is adulthood being ascribed to maturity. So it's not based upon whether or not you're 18 or you're 21 or you're 25. Because I've seen people acquire this and they're not, and they're 18 and somebody else is still working on this and they're 25. Now, granted, different people grow at different paces and stages. But I'm saying that this is when you're able to assess whether or not they've reached the kind of adulthood that allows them to be full-fledged adults and not halfway adults. Number three, let's look at number three. All right, number three. And then I'll be summarizing this up soon. All right. So let's look in here at number three. Once again, if you have questions, you can put it on our LifeEmpowermentCh page or on our YouTube channel. All right, here's number three. Though I am deeply affected by my significant relationships throughout my life, I can't blame my problems on anyone but myself. That's an adult conviction. Let me say that again. Though I am deeply affected by my significant relationships throughout my life, I can't blame my problems on anyone but myself. Number four. though I will always fail and need support. See, that's recognizing that maturity, this process. Remember, we were talking earlier that part of maturity is gaining information and being able to know that when I apply this, probably in the beginning, I'm probably going to have some level of failure. And that's okay. That's okay. I can accept that. Right? It says, though I will always fail and need support, I can't depend on some over-responsible individual to constantly bail me out spiritually, emotionally, financially, or relational crisis. Man, I'm telling you, when I read that, even I had to, I said, boy, that's strong. But listen, that's what adulthood is. Adulthood is eating that which is strong. Though I always fail and need support, I can't depend on some over-responsible individual to constantly, that's the key, constantly. I may have times where I need help here and there, but constantly bail me out of spiritual, emotional, financial, or relational crises. So these are the kind of convictions that over a period of having had discipline, teaching, positive, negative punishment, understanding those are the pieces to my discipline, to my teaching. Understanding those variables are going to be a part of the lessons learned, that at the end, I'm going to have these kind of convictions. See, remember, we're talking about discipline. We're talking about training. We're talking about educating. Train a child in the way that he or she should go. See, when I understand these convictions, it removes a lot of excuses. Well, you know, I'm doing this because I'm lonely. Well, how responsible are you to deal with those areas of your life? Well, you know, I had this dysfunctional family. I understand that you may have been dealt a bad hand, but the reality is, how long are you going to play that? At some point, I have to be able to say, okay, if this is what I lack, what is it that I need to have instilled? What do I need to have repaired so that I can become a healthy, fully functional adult? That's what adulthood entails. This is what it means to raise children, to have them to be fully adults. So I have to ask myself, am I repairing boundaries? Am I instilling boundaries? And sometimes we have to have what I call, or what the book calls, safe suffering, age-appropriate consequences. And they tell a story in the book, but I would tell you there's a book that really goes a lot more into the story that they tell. And the name of this book is called Raising Financially Confident Children. And the author, her name is Mary Hunt. And I heard Mary Hunt telling this story about how she and her husband were raising their children. And I'm going to end on this story. And she was talking about how her and her husband had gotten into some real significant financial debt. I'm sure that she mentioned the amount, but I would tell you it was a large amount. It was like thousands and thousands of dollars. And she said that they had to work hard to get themselves out of that debt. And she says that, you know, they had to unlearn a lot of behaviors, a lot of what we're talking about. They had to instill some boundaries. They had to repair some boundaries. And so they're working hard at this, and they finally get to a place to where they're out of debt. They have these young children, and they're saying, we don't want them to learn the hard way that we learned. And so they are wanting to set them up for success. And they came up with this kind of out-of-the-box pathway. And they said, here's what we're going to do. The kids were young, I mean like elementary age school. And they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up a plan by which we're going to give them X amount of dollars. And we're going to tell them, hey, you know, age appropriate. Remember, safe suffering, age appropriate. And we're going to make them responsible for certain things in their lives, right? And so they start off by giving them money that they were responsible for if they wanted to go to a party and they were going to buy gifts for their friends. They were responsible for their lunch. If you were going to buy lunch at school, they said, listen, you can prepare your lunch with the food that we buy, but if you want to buy the school lunch, hey, this money that we're giving you is going to entail that. And they gave them just a few more other responsibilities that were germane to their particular life. Well, what do you think the kids did? They would do like any other kid would do. Oh, they gave them the money and they were giving increments like a monthly check. And so they took that money and they wanted to go to the toy store. And so they were buying toys and the parents were allowing them to do this. And they would say, hey, they need to learn this lesson early. As much as they tried to be positive and give them the information early, the reality is that remember, discipline teaching, there's a positive, negative, the punishment, all three stages, that some of this they were going to have to learn through their own life punishment. And so they spent, quite a few times, the parents were sometimes wondering, what did we do? Is this right? And the kids would sometimes go and spend all their money going out to eat, going to go get toys. And so, a week into the month, they don't have any more money. And they had to sometimes let them live the consequences, because then when it was time to go to the party, well, do you have money? No, we don't have money. I guess you can't go to the party. And it was like time for them to go to school, and sometimes they didn't pack their lunch, and they would let them go to school. And they would come home starving, and they were like, and they were looking at them as they were dealing with the consequences of mismanaging their money. And you would think like, man, this is not going to end well. This is not going to be good. But here's what happened. Eventually, they caught on. Eventually, they understood that if we don't manage this well, we're going to suffer. And what ended up happening was, as much as this started off real rocky, real horrible, real devastating, and this was devastating for the parents to watch this as their kids were suffering. By the time these kids started really getting a hold of this, they said that they started managing money better than what they as parents were managing money. By the time these kids were in high school, these kids had saved enough money to buy their own car. As they were getting older, they were giving them more responsibilities. Obviously, they were increasing their monthly allotment, but they were giving them more responsibilities. And they were learning how to manage their money with all these different responsibilities. And listen, when you would think that these kids were trying to get the latest fad, these kids were going to the thrift store and they were buying their clothes there. They were saving their money because they wanted to spend their money on the things that were more worthwhile than the things that were just temporary pleasures. And they eventually became such wise stewards of their money that they went off to school, paid for their way in college, paid their entire way through college. They bought a house. I have to go back and read, but they may have bought a house like while they were in college. This was how financial savvy they had become. And their parents looked back and they were so glad that they allowed them to have safe suffering so that they might acquire the kind of skill sets that made them wise investors when they got older. And I'm saying to you that sometimes built within this boundary development process, it is the positive, it's the negative, it's the punishment that we have to be comfortable with in order to help cultivate and develop good boundaries in our children. And when we recognize that we sometimes lack those very same things, that we have to go back and say, okay, am I instilling this boundary or am I repairing this boundary? So that I might have what I need to be a full-fledged adult. So that I might be able to know what I need to give my children for them to be full-fledged adults. Because it is our responsibility to now give the children the kind of boundaries that allow the next generation to be better, not worse, not recline, but that they are starting off from a higher ground, Why? Because we have set things in motion so that we are building generational legacies versus building generational nightmares. And so, listen, I thank you so much for the opportunity that I've had today to be able to share with you as we have talked about boundaries with children. Listen, I'm looking to see whether or not there are any questions that we have here on our Facebook page. I don't see any questions here. I'm looking YouTube, and I don't see any questions there, which is fine. Like I said, this is always an opportunity for you to ask questions. If you don't have questions, not a problem. But I just want you to know that, listen, I appreciate the opportunity that you've given me today to be able to help you understand what these boundaries look like with children. And remember, as we end on this note, listen, you are made for relationship. I was made for relationship. You're made, listen, you can't do this without people. You need people. You must have places where you're connected, where you are loved unconditionally. Listen, there's the old African proverb that it takes a village, not just to grow the child, but to grow us. And so, listen, I don't want you to ever think that what we talk about here means giving up on people. What we talk about here means, listen, we have to repair people. We have to learn how to grow so that we can become all that God had in mind for us as adults. So, listen, I just want to thank you again, listen, for being here with Ruffin It. Listen, it is that time. And I hope that you have really gotten a whole lot. If you miss any of this, listen, you can come back, watch the replay, because this will be on our YouTube channel. This will be on our Life Empowerment Church page. And so, listen, I just want to thank you for the opportunity. A few things I just want to bring to your attention as we are bringing this to a close. I'm asking you that, listen, if you are watching here right now, I'm asking you, listen, to like our Life Empowerment Church page. I'm asking you to follow us because, listen, we have some great things in store. I'm asking that if you're on YouTube, subscribe to our channel. Click the bell icon so that you can get the notifications. We thank you so much for being here. We thank you so much for being a part of this. Listen, I want to let you know that, listen, we appreciate the fact that you're here. But listen, we want to give you the opportunity to be able to help this happen. You ask, how does this happen? This is sponsored by Life Empowerment Church. So your donations, your offerings, your financial contributions to Life Empowerment Church is what helps make this come forward. Because listen, there's time and preparation, as you can tell, that is put into this. And so listen, you help us help you by you helping us financially. So listen, there are a few things I want to put on the screen for you. And so listen, if you would like to give by digitally, you can give by Cash App. That information is there on your screen. Listen, if you want to give by PayPal, that information is right there on your screen. If you would like to be able to give according to maybe mailing a check, writing a money order, then listen, you can do just that also. That information is there on your screen right now. And so, listen, we just thank you so much for your giving today. We thank you. We appreciate it so much. Listen, another thing I want to tell you about is, listen, for all the men that are here, listen, whether you are a man that is here or you know a man, you know a brother, you know a father, you have a friend, listen, I'm going to be doing a Monday Man Cave, talking to men about kingship. And so the information is there on your screen. It's a free event. It's online. But they're asking that you RSVP at www.ndi.vision. It's going to be 6 p.m. this Monday coming up, Pacific Standard Time. And so, listen, I'm encouraging you to make sure that you sign up for this. We did one last month. We're doing another one this month. We're going to see where things go from here. But listen, I am excited about this opportunity to really be able to speak to men, because listen, there are 3 stages of manhood. There's maleship, there's manship, then there's kingship. And listen, we're talking about kingship, but I'm kind of referring back to the other two so that you really have a good understanding of what this looks like. And so, listen, I want to thank you so much for that. Listen, we also want to let you know about Noonday Prayer. Listen, we do prayer here Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noontime. And so, listen, I want to invite you to come out to be here. It'll be on our YouTube channel. It'll be on our Facebook page. And so, listen, this is going to be a great time. Come out, be a part of our Noonday Prayer. The last thing I want to bring to your awareness is our prayer walk. We have a prayer walk that's coming up this Saturday. This prayer walk is going to be here locally here in Moreno Valley, California. And so, listen, the information is there on your screen, 7 a.m. We're doing this prayer walk. It is going to be at our City Hall. And so we're asking that you come out. It's about an hour time that we're there. Listen, you know what we're fighting. You know what we're up against here in this world, in this society. And so, listen, as we are talking to you also about voting, we recognize that, listen, we vote and we pray. We are dealing with what's happening in our world spiritually, and we're dealing with what's happening in our world naturally. And so, listen, I'm telling you, make sure that you're registered to vote. If you don't know if you're registered, check it out at vote.org. Listen, there have been people that have been deregistered in various states. You don't want to see that happen to you. So listen, make sure that you check out your voter registration so that you can register and you can vote when it is time to vote. And so listen, I just want to thank you so much for being here today with Ruffin It. I pray that you have had a great time. I pray that this has been an enlightening time. I hope that it has maybe given you some insight, some knowledge, some information, maybe given you a little clarity. But I hope it has been well worth every minute, every second, the hour that you've been here with us today. And so, listen, thank you so much. With that, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I look forward to seeing you this weekend for our Sunday weekend service. If I don't see you then, I look forward to seeing you next week for Ruffin It right here again Thursdays at 4 p.m. God bless you. We love you. We'll see you soon.